I'm Steve Gompertz of QRx Partners, and welcome to this week's Quality Heretic discussion. If you've been watching these or you follow any of the posts from QRx Partners, we like to talk about risk management a lot. And this week is going to be no different for the Quality Heretic discussion. What I want to talk about in particular is the concept of risk estimation scales. Now, I'm going to do this from a med tech perspective. I mean, that's where I do the majority of my work and where I've spent my career. And so we're going to be talking about ISO 14971's view of risk, where it defines risk as a combination of the severity and probability of the harm. Now, if you're not in the medtech space and you're following something like ISO 31000 and 31001, the words are different, but the concepts are essentially the same. There, they talk about impact, right, and the likelihood of something occurring. So it's not that different. I stick with the video, and you should see something similar. So, given that we have these two properties, right, that combined create a view of risk, help us identify risk levels. Um, we often have this somewhere in your risk management procedure, right? We create these tables, one for severity, one for probability, that gives us a way to put something into our FMEAs or other risk analysis tools. So we get everybody consistently addressing, right? How bad do we think this could be, and how likely is it to occur? That's great, right? You want to create that kind of consistency. So there's not a problem with the fact that you have these tables. It's just how you lay them out. And so, right, we go through the process of identifying the risks and then evaluating severity and probability. And then ultimately, we end up usually with something like this also in our procedure, a risk level table, right? That helps us then assess or evaluate the risk and go, so where did we end up? Are we high, medium, or low in terms of criticality of each risk, right? And it's just a simple matrix of the severity scales and the probability scales. All right, that's great. And it certainly helps to quickly visualize where we at. But I don't know if anybody sees it right off the bat, but there is a problem here, right? There is a potential problem. And I want you to look at two values at the two corners, upper right and lower left, right? They both have the same rating, okay? They both calculate out the same if we multiply severity times probability. And you have to ask the question, well, really? Are they the same? Is something that's critical, and critical in the medtech space is usually reserved for death, right, as the result. And it's negligible, but it's not zero probability, right? It's a non-zero probability of death. And then the other corner, upper right, it's something that happens a lot, but it has minimal impact, right? Minimal severity. Are those really the same? I don't know that I would consider that, right? The fact that there's a chance of death, even though it's very small, that's not the same as something annoying that happens a lot to me. That's kind of how I look at it, right? So I think that's a fundamental flaw in our scales. All right, so what's the solution here? Well, I think people don't think enough about this. When they put those scales together, there's no rules about what they need to look like. There was nothing that said, thou shalt use a linear scale, one, two, three, four, five. Nobody said it had to be 5 levels. I've seen them as much as 20 levels, right? And there's no rule that says they have to be the same. That just because one scale is 1 through 5 doesn't mean the other one can't be 1 through 8, right? And I've seen that done as well, right? Particularly on the probability side, where maybe you have good data, and so statistically you can calculate probability with more accuracy, so therefore you can get more granularity in there and have more levels. Severity, I've seen that get more granular. I don't think that's a good way to go, because then you start getting into a lot of debate because it's not always quantifiable. So it ends up being more of an opinion thing, right? So the fewer opinions they get to choose from, the better. But anyway, those things don't exist as rules. Nobody said you must have a 5 level 1 through 5 scale. Okay. So if we go back to these and we say, you know what? We're in med tech, we're all about, right, safety and effectiveness. Maybe severity is the thing we care about more. Maybe we should weight that, more so than probability. So if instead of a 1 to 5 scale, what if we did that, right? To create a very increasing differentiation in the severity levels, right? To say by the time we get to catastrophic, which usually is defined as death of the patient or the user, yeah, we want to make sure that's clearly very different than anything else, right? As we go down the list. And so now, if you put that into that matrix, you get a very different look at your risk levels and your risk criticality, right? And notice that the zones have changed, right? It makes you rethink your zones. But now, at those two corners that I talked about, right, there's clear differentiation. Something that involves death is definitely differentiated from something that's just more annoying, right? Regardless of the probabilities, right? And that's the point, is that it gives severity sort of an override capability. Now, I'm not saying you have to distribute it this way. That 81 down in the lower left, I suppose, could be a gold and say, look, it's a medium risk at that point because it's a negligible probability. That is something you would need to figure out as an organization and be prepared to defend. How did you know that, right? What's your clinical basis for that? But I think this gives you a clear picture of, again, those differences in the risk levels so that you make better decisions. Because otherwise, the 1 through 5 in both scales, I hate to use this term, but it kind of gets lazy, right? And everybody just kind of goes, "Yep, that's great. We don't, and then right, because this dictates the type of actions you're going to take, and it kind of creates that comfort that, oh, I guess we don't have to do as much about that one because it ended up in the low category." And you go, well, still somebody might die. So I think, it's good to consider whether or not you should differentiate these scales, either one or both of them, to create a more realistic view of your risk levels. So, as always, want to hear your thoughts, right? Especially if somebody's got a good approach to share. I think this would be a really good one to hear what is your methodology for your risk scales. But let's get that in the comments and see what people have to say. Otherwise, I'll see you next week on the next Quality Heretic video.